Good evening. It's great to be with you. My name is Sheila Davis. I am a pediatrician and a public health physician, Boulder County Public Health. My pronouns are she, her, hers. We acknowledge that Boulder County is on land within the territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. We acknowledge the institution we represent was founded upon the exclusion and attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples and cultures. And we acknowledge the American Indian community in Boulder County today, the elders past and present, and future generations.
Thank you. Thank you to Sheila and to Charlie. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marty Moore. I'm the Executive Director of Out Boulder County, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Thank you for joining this evening and for sharing your precious time with us on this important subject. Before we start tonight, and in light of this week's tragedy and the murders of 10 precious people in our community at our beloved King Soopers, I'd like to say a few words about grief from my perspective. We each have our own way of grieving. There's no right and there's no wrong way to do it. There's no, I should have cried by now. There's no, I need to quit crying. What I do know about my own grief is that sharing my sadness with others is helpful. If you find yourself alone, with no one to process your feelings with, please reach out, and we will offer a listening ear and help you find the resources that you need to continue your healing. Charlie is dropping some contact information into the chat, so please capture those numbers if you will, because your safety and well-being means the world to us. Together, we're going to make it through this horrendous time. Part of being able to gather again in times like this, and also in moments of joy, is for us all to be vaccinated, which is why we're here tonight. In late December, Out Boulder County's Dr. Kaylin Gray conducted what we found to be the first research in the nation on LGBTQ people and our thoughts about the COVID vaccines. Little did we know it was the first one, but since then, the Human Rights Campaign and the Kaiser Family Foundation have conducted similar surveys and have found similar results. Tonight, with our important community partners that include Boulder County Public Health, Boulder Community Health, Inside Out Services in El Paso County, Southern Colorado Equality Alliance in Pueblo County, Castle Rock Pride in Douglas County, because we know the virus does not stop at the county line. I want to appreciate the partnerships that we are starting to develop throughout the state. And to BCAP. Tonight, we're going to hear from real doctors with real experience in treating and serving our communities. They will answer your questions with facts. And if we don't get to all questions tonight, they will be captured in the chat and information will be sent to you after this. This gathering is being recorded this evening, so you can come back and catch pieces that you might have missed. They will pay special attention to our sexual orientations and our gender identities. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome, and now I turn it over to my friend and the Executive Director of Boulder County AIDS Project, Frank Ocana.
Thank you, Marty. I'm Frank Ocana. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the Executive Director for Boulder County AIDS Project, also known as BCAP. BCAP is the HIV service organization providing services to people living with HIV and people at risk of acquiring HIV or hepatitis C in Boulder, Broomfield, Gilpin, and Clear Creek counties in Colorado. We at BCAP are so very proud to partner with the agencies and providers here today as we all continue to provide services to and advocate for health equity for LGBTQ individuals and their communities, including people living with HIV. Out Boulder County's COVID-19 vaccine survey and vaccination clinics and today's town hall are all at the heart of health equity for LGBTQ people. And today, as we hear information from public health and medical experts, and in the days and months ahead, as more and more of us get vaccinated, we will begin and continue to heal from a year of anxiety, isolation, hardship, and loss that we've only been able to endure because of compassion, because of science, our frontline workers, hope, and access. Equitable access to information and testing, vaccination, and healthcare are all needed in our fight against COVID-19 and in our return to community life. On behalf of Boulder County Project, I just want to thank everyone who joined in tonight's program, and I'll turn it over to Jose Garcia Madrid with Boulder County.
Thank you, Frank. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jose. I am with Boulder County, and I am a programming coordinator for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, LGBTQ communities, and with OBC. But we know that you're here today because you want information about COVID, the COVID vaccine, about the ways that it impacts you as a person who is LGBTQ, who's queer or trans or non-binary, perhaps even gender non-conforming. We have two individuals who are going to set the scene for us. They'll give us foundational knowledge on COVID, on the COVID vaccine. After the presentation, we'll do a Q&A sort of session with all of the panelists, including the two presenters, where we'll specifically talk about issues that you all identified in the surveys that Marty talked about. But first, I would like to introduce Dr. Heather Pouget, as well as Alicia Maltzman, who's a nurse practitioner. They both work at Beacon Clinic for infectious disease, whose clients include people who live with HIV, as well as patients who take PrEP for HIV prevention. And so please go ahead and take the mic, you two. We're so excited to hear this information.
Excellent. I will go ahead and start. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. My name is Dr. Heather Pouget, and I'm an infectious disease doctor at Boulder Community Health. For some of you out there in the audience, you may know me, but for those of you who do not, the first thing I would like to say is that I have zero affiliation with any pharmaceutical company or vaccine company. I can say the same for Alicia Maltzman as well. Before I start, I'd like to give a shout out to my other infectious disease colleagues at Boulder Community Health, Doctors Meditz, Turner, and King, who have also been working very hard over the past year during this pandemic. So thank you again for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to provide you with information on the vaccinations for COVID-19. Next slide. So we can all agree that the COVID-19 pandemic has been the biggest public health threat in over a century. And when we look at these big numbers, it is easy to become numb to them. And there's a saying that you all may have heard that one death is a tragedy and 1 million deaths is a statistic. But that's wrong. And although one death is indeed a tragedy, 1 million deaths is 1 million tragedies. And we must remember that every number you see on this screen represents a human life, a human being, a person, and a soul. Next slide. With that, I'm going to jump right into the science, and we're going to talk about the mRNA vaccines, which include the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which in my opinion represent a true scientific advancement and marvel. The way I would like you to think about mRNA is that it is essentially a recipe for something. And in this context, it's a recipe for the spike protein. You can see a little drawing on the left of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And this virus uses these little red spikes, or uses spikes to gain entry into our cells. In turn, our body makes an immune protein called an antibody against spike to prevent that from happening. Now, I will tell you that this mRNA technology has been around for decades. It's not something new, but it has been very difficult to develop and make an mRNA vaccine because when mRNA enters our body immediately wipes it up. But what we've recently figured out is that if we encase this synthetic mRNA, and I would like to point out, there is no virus involved in this vaccine at all. No live virus, no weakened virus, no inactivated virus. This is synthetic mRNA encoding the spike protein. If we encapsulate it with a little fatty bubble that you can see on the right, that is an effective way to deliver mRNA to a human cell. And so our body doesn't mop it up before it gets to where it needs to go. Next slide. All right, this slide may look a little complicated, but here's what I want you to get out of it. And again, these are just amazing vaccines and how they work. And what you can see on the left side, you can see the little mRNA encased in this fatty bubble. When a vaccine becomes a vaccination and goes into your arm, it will encounter some cells. It will encounter perhaps a muscle cell or a myocyte or a macrophage, which is an immune cell. And you can see that it enters into the cell. It does not go into the nucleus of the cell, which is that little kind of lighter green part. It never enters the nucleus. So it cannot affect our hard drive or our DNA. Spike protein is then made. It's presented to the surface of the cell, and this triggers a complex immune response orchestrated by cells called T cells, which then talk to B cells, which make these virus neutralizing antibodies. The other thing that we're left behind with are memory T and B cells that provide longer lasting immune memory against this virus. Next slide. Actually, please go back one slide. Thank you. Some take-home points that I want you to get from this slide. Number one, again, it does not interfere ever with our DNA because these vaccines never enter, the mRNA never enters the nucleus of the cell. Secondly, there is no virus involved in these vaccines, so you cannot get COVID-19 from these vaccines. And lastly, the one thing I also want to mention is that these vaccines contain no additives and no preservatives, which is important to a lot of people. Next slide now, please. All right, now the big thing on everybody's mind is how did these vaccines get developed so quickly? Well, here's the deal. We were in a unique situation. In the middle of a pandemic, people were dying. So the scientific community, both the public and private sectors, pivoted and spent all their efforts focusing on this vaccine. We also poured extensive amounts of dollars into this, billions of dollars, and we already had existing mRNA technology to build on. Now, I will also say that Operation Warp Speed, that moniker does not inspire a lot of confidence. But what I will tell you is the backstory to this is that the individual at the FDA whose idea it was to develop this vaccine was a big Trekkie. So that's how it got the name Operation Warp Speed. I will also assure you that no steps were skipped. Again, no steps were skipped in the development of this vaccine. They were simply made more efficient. And I will tell you that ironically, because this pandemic was completely out of control, particularly our disastrous efforts in the United States, we were able to show that this vaccine worked in a shorter amount of time. Excuse me, in a shorter amount of time. When a vaccine is developed, it goes through a few phases. There's phase 1, which involves small number of clinical trial participants, phase 2, larger numbers, and then phase 3, much larger numbers. And again, because this pandemic was out of control And because we poured billions of dollars into this, we were able to see that this vaccine worked. And the FDA, after poring over extensive amounts of data, along with different review boards that evaluated this data, they gave an emergency use authorization. Now, that can also engender a little bit of uncomfortability, just given the words emergency use authorization. But what I will tell you is the only difference between an EUA and a fully licensed vaccine is time, and time alone. Next slide. Now, the FDA said, you probably all heard this, that they would be happy with a vaccine that would have 50% efficacy. Now, at the top, you'll see in red, the BNT162b2 is basically the chemical name for Pfizer's vaccine. And the bottom line is that both of these mRNA vaccines had an efficacy of over 95%, which was just absolutely extraordinary. And this efficacy was demonstrated across racial and ethnic groups, sexes, and most importantly, across age groups as well, which a lot of times we do not see with vaccines. Importantly, 2 doses are required to achieve this efficacy. It is imperative that you get the 2nd dose of this vaccine. And it's really important now with circulating variants that require higher titers of neutralizing antibodies to be effective. Of note, this protection is not immediate. It takes up to 2 weeks after the 2nd dose to be considered fully vaccinated. So again, 95% efficacy blew everyone out of the water. Next slide. All right, let's talk about some side effects because everybody wants to know about that. And it's extremely important to be aware of these. These vaccines, both Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA vaccines, are what we call reactogenic vaccines. And for anybody out there who's ever had the Shingrix vaccine or the shingles vaccine knows what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about are expected side effects. Okay, these are expected side effects. Not everybody gets them, but a lot of people do. In the clinical trials, the side effects were more common in younger people, those under 55. And all this means when you get these side effects is that your immune system is responding to the vaccine. It is responding to the fact that you just got a vaccination and your immune system is kicking into high gear. If people develop side effects, the side effects can be both local at the site of the injection, which can be pain, redness, and swelling, and then they can be systemic, which can affect the whole body. And those were manifested in the form of myalgias, which are muscle aches and pains, fatigue. People complained of headache, fevers, and chills. One person I know actually had a temperature as high as 103. However, I will tell you, again, that was her immune system kicking in. Not everybody gets these, younger people more so than people over 55. These are short-lived. They last maybe 1 to 2 days, then you're back to yourself. And what I tell my patients is that you can take Tylenol or Motrin if you get these side effects. You do not need to take them ahead of time. And in fact, it's not recommended to do so because Motrin, for example, can interfere with the innate immune system. I'm not going to get into the weeds with that, but you don't need to pre-medicate. But if you do get these symptoms, you can take Tylenol or Motrin. They last a day or two. And again, I tell my patients, schedule the vaccine on a day when you don't have to work the next 2 days, for example, a Friday, and so you can rest over the weekend. Next slide. I would also like to mention that there is a very small risk of anaphylaxis. And if you don't know what anaphylaxis is a very serious allergic reaction manifested by throat closure, lip and tongue swelling, and it can be a little scary, to be honest with you. And we started to see this as we rolled these vaccines out in the general public. Now, I would like to say that the risk in general with any vaccine with anaphylaxis is about 1 per million. With the 2 mRNA vaccines, the risk is still very, very low, but slightly higher. And with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which I will also talk about, which uses a different technology, there were only 2 cases seen late in the phase 3 clinical trials. More data are forthcoming. Now, most of these serious allergic reactions occurred in the first 15 minutes of receiving the vaccine, which is why we have people hang around for 15 minutes to make sure that everything is okay. Anaphylaxis is felt to occur, again, exceedingly rarely, because of this little fatty bubble that the synthetic mRNA is encased in. And particularly, there are a couple of ingredients. One is called PEG-2000, which is polyethylene glycol, which is included in the Moderna and Pfizer mRNA vaccines. And then there's an ingredient in the J&J vaccine, which again uses a different platform called polysorbate. Take-home point is, this is very, very rare, but higher than with other vaccines. But again, exceedingly rare, usually occurs in the first 15 minutes. Alicia will also talk more about this. I would also like to mention that there is a very, very small and infrequent risk of a reaction with people who have had dermal fillers and these mRNA vaccines, so Pfizer and Moderna. And this is notable because I take care of many long-term survivors with HIV who had to take some pretty hard antiretrovirals in the past that caused lipoatrophy, particularly in the cheeks, or fat loss, and who have received dermal fillers for that. Now, very rarely and infrequently, what we have seen is that you can see a very temporary or ephemeral swelling at the site of the prior dermal filler, typically the face or the lips, and this is not considered a contraindication to the Pfizer or Moderna vaccinations. Again, very rare, very infrequent, but I did want to mention this because I do take care of patients who have received these dermal fillers. I should also point out that this is not Botox, okay? It has nothing to do with Botox. Next slide. Regarding evaluation of other vaccine safety events, something else that we can see with these mRNA vaccines are swollen lymph nodes at the site where the vaccine was given. For example, under the armpit. I've heard that actually from several patients. They're like, oh, I have some swollen lymph nodes under my armpit. I'm like, oh, that's great. Okay, that's the vaccine doing what it should be doing. It's an immune response. You have lymph nodes under there. They're doing their thing. So this is not uncommon. Again, transient, goes away. Regarding other neurologic conditions, such as Bell's palsy, which is a paralysis of one side of the face. They did initially see this in 4 vaccine recipients, 0 in the placebo group. However, when the data were scrutinized, they actually discovered that the number of cases seen in the vaccine group was completely consistent with the incidence in the general population or the background rate. So translation is, this was not related to the vaccine. There were also no cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is another serious neurologic disorder. So in summary, we have not seen any concerning signals for adverse events with these vaccines. Next slide. All right, we're going to pivot to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, otherwise known as Janssen, or what we also call the one and done vaccine. Next slide, please. All right. This vaccine, as I just mentioned, uses a different technology. It uses a modified adenovirus or adenovirus 26, which is essentially a common cold virus. Now, I should point out that this common cold virus, adeno 26, cannot replicate and it cannot cause illness. All it does is act as a Trojan horse to deliver the payload, okay? In this context, instead of mRNA, it's delivering DNA of the spike protein. I should also mention that we have experience with this vaccine with the Ebola vaccine. It also uses adeno 26 technology, as well as the Zika vaccine. In this little cartoon, you can see that it enters the cell, it injects the DNA into the nucleus of the cell, but again, it does not integrate into our hard drive or our human genome. This spike protein ultimately gets translated and processed, and it triggers, again, a complex series of immune responses, no different than the 2 mRNA vaccines. Next slide. All right, let's talk about efficacy, because I know people on the news and in the public have been quibbling over these numbers, and I'll get to a slide on that in a second. But this is a single dose vaccine, which really has a lot of pluses. It's very hard for some people to come back for that second dose. Again, it's much easier to get a one and done vaccine. There were over 43,000 people in this clinical trial. And what they found overall is that it had an efficacy of about 66% for preventing symptomatic COVID-19. Similar to the mRNA vaccines, they found similar efficacy across age, sex, racial groups, ethnic groups, and comorbid conditions. Now, if you look at this little table on the right, really what I want you to look at first is the fact that this one and done vaccine prevented death in 100% of vaccine recipients. Notably, this vaccine was tested in a very different environment. Not only was it tested in the United States, but it was tested in South Africa and Brazil, where, as you probably have heard, there are serious variants of concern circulating in those parts of the world. And again, it prevented death 100% of the time. It prevented severe to critical illness in over 80% of participants. And in the United States, moderate to severe disease in 72% of participants. So again, a highly effective and safe vaccine with one shot. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about side effects with the J&J vaccine. So less so than with the mRNA vaccines. They were less frequent side effects. And again, in the clinical trials, if you're going to get side effects, they're more common in younger people, and they include really similar reactions. So pain, redness, and swelling at the injection site, systemic reactions, again, kind of your whole body feeling like you kind of have the flu, headache, fatigue, some muscle aches. But these are transient. Again, they last for a day or two and they're gone. Regarding unusual adverse reactions, these were extremely rare. Some hives, they saw some ringing in the ears, some clotting events that were felt to be confounders, and then 2 cases of anaphylaxis, which I talked about previously. So again, a highly safe and effective vaccine. Next slide, please. All right, so let me talk about why you cannot compare and quibble over the 95% efficacy. I want the mRNA vaccines versus the J&J, it's only 72% or 60%. We can't do that. It's like comparing apples and oranges, and here's why. The mRNA vaccines were tested at a very different time of year. They were tested in the summertime when the incidence of COVID-19 was lower. They were tested in the United States against the parent strain of this virus, not the variants, okay? Now, when you look at J&J, J&J had to weather a major storm. It was tested in the wintertime when the incidence of COVID-19 was through the roof. And as you saw in my other slide, it was tested in various parts of the world, including Brazil and South Africa, where the majority of cases were caused by variants of concern, the B1351 in South Africa and the P1 in Brazil. And it held up, preventing death 100% of the time and critical illness in over 80%. So again, it's like comparing apples and oranges. And the J&J vaccine gave us really fabulous real world data with a one-shot vaccine that held up very well. And because of this, the CDC said, we're not making a preference on which vaccine you get. Any of the 3, we highly recommend. So I hope that all makes sense. Next slide, please. Now, what about HIV positive patient representation in these clinical trials? This is really important. And initially, the HIV community really did a fabulous thing and stood up and said, hey, you don't have enough of us in these clinical trials. And the vaccine makers listened and started including more HIV positive patients in their trials, but still not enough. Moderna and Pfizer, the two mRNA vaccines, included between 100 and 200 patients. So again, very small numbers when you look at overall numbers. J&J had many more, 1,200 plus, but still not enough. And they included patients who had stable HIV. So T cell counts of over 200 and undetectable viral loads. And what they saw is no concerning safety signals for the HIV patients who were given and administered these vaccines. And none so far have been released from the data from the CDC. That being said, what we need to know is how this vaccine works in various subgroups of folks with HIV. For example, someone with poorly controlled or untreated HIV with a detectable viral load and a T cell count of 20 is very different from someone with long-standing, well-controlled HIV and a T cell count of 300, 400, or 500, and again, a long-standing undetectable viral load. So those data are forthcoming with those subgroups. Now, the Department of Health and Human Services did absolutely the right thing and said, because these vaccines are so safe and effective, we recommend any of the 3 FDA emergency use authorized approved vaccines for COVID-19, which include the 2 mRNA vaccines, Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech, or the adenovirus vector vaccine, J&J, for HIV patients, regardless of T cell count or viral load. So this is what I tell my patients. Now, regarding patients who receive pre-exposure prophylaxis, same thing applies. It was not parsed out in these data whether patients were receiving PrEP or not, but again, I give the same guidance to all of my patients, my HIV patients, and my PrEP patients, is that these vaccines are safe and effective, and I would recommend any of these 3 vaccines. And when patients ask me which one should I get, I say whichever one you can get. Just roll up your sleeve and get whichever one you can. Next slide, please.
Well, hi, my name is Alicia Maltzman. I can't see me, I still see Heather, but that's okay. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a nurse practitioner. I work with Heather Puget at the Beacon Center for Infectious Diseases at Boulder Community Health. And thank you so much, Heather, for presenting that large amount of data in such an easy to understand way. I feel so lucky to work with you and the rest of our team. On to the next slide. Who should get the COVID vaccine? And the answer is practically everyone, with the exception of a very small few. So if you look by age, the EUA was only approved for those 18 and older, and Pfizer is 16 and older. So age is a limiting factor in getting the vaccine. Pfizer and Moderna currently have studies down to 6 months old, and J&J is looking at individuals 12 years and older with plans to go down to at least 6 months. Another group is those with prior SARS-CoV-2 infection or COVID. So the vaccine is recommended for individuals previously infected with COVID. Why? To prevent reinfection. Science shows that protection from vaccine is more consistent and more durable than protection from natural infection. And so it is recommended to get the vaccine. When should you get the vaccine if you've had prior infection? The answer is to wait your isolation period. So wait those 10 days and be symptom-free. And you can wait up to 90 days because you are likely protected against reinfection during that time. Next slide, please. Again, who should get the vaccine? Those with any underlying condition, and that includes HIV, other immunocompromising conditions, and those taking immunosuppressants, all of those individuals can get the vaccine. As Heather said, there have been no safety signals, but there is the possibility of a reduced immune response to or protection created by the vaccine. And studies are ongoing for these specific populations. Even those with a history of anaphylaxis to past vaccines or any injectable can receive the vaccine. The CDC would recommend that you talk to your provider. In clinical practice, typically, these individuals are monitored for a longer period of time, 30 minutes instead of 15 minutes, but they can still get the vaccine, and it is recommended by most, if not all, providers that they do. Who should not get the vaccine? Those with anaphylaxis to PEG or a PEG derivative, as Heather described earlier, or any component of the vaccine that they've had anaphylaxis to in the past. PEG and derivatives are known ingredients in certain vaccines, in these vaccines. And if you have had anaphylaxis to these ingredients, you can still seek an allergy evaluation for desensitization. And if you can be desensitized, you can still receive the vaccine. So I think that Heather answered the questions about those on PrEP and the vaccine. But to reassure individuals, HIV medications, including Truvada or Descovy, which are used for PrEP, don't interfere with the vaccine, or vice versa. The vaccine wouldn't interfere with these medications. Next slide, please. So how does the vaccine change my life? This vaccine allows for the path back to normalcy. The CDC announced recommendations earlier this month, and they are outlined below. For those fully vaccinated, and as Heather said, fully vaccinated is 2 weeks after the second shot in a 2-dose series, or 2 weeks after the single dose vaccine. Currently, the only single dose vaccine is J&J. But how will it change these fully vaccinated people? So the first scenario is everyone's vaccinated in a private, not public space, but private space. You can mingle without restrictions. The CDC also said that vaccinated individuals can meet in private spaces with unvaccinated people from one other household, unless individuals from that other household are at risk for severe illness from COVID. The second group that they outlined were vaccinated individuals around unvaccinated individuals from more than one household and in public spaces. And the recommendation is still to mask and distance in that situation. And so why not in public spaces? And the answer is, there are too many variables. We have unknown vaccination status. We know that that no vaccine is 100% protective. And we are still learning about vaccinated individuals' ability or not to infect others. So the majority of real world data show it is unlikely, but the risk is not zero. And we are still seeing 50,000 plus cases of COVID a day. The risk will not be closer to zero until we can get those numbers down and learn more about the risk to infect others if you are infected after vaccination. The third group shown there are the unvaccinated with the unvaccinated, and the recommendation is to keep masking and distancing. One benefit to being fully vaccinated is there is no need to quarantine or get tested after an exposure unless you develop symptoms. If you develop symptoms, you do need to get tested. Our goal is to get the masks off. So hopefully we'll able to get these numbers down and get more people vaccinated. But until that time, the theoretical risk is still there. The more people who are vaccinated, the better the protection for our community. Next slide, please. What about long-term side effects? I think because the vaccines have been around for a short period of time, people are concerned about long-term side effects. Some people are talking about waiting a year or two to see if it's safe. And let me tell you why you don't need to do this. If we were going to see side effects, history tells us we would have seen them already. The long-term side effects after any licensed vaccine to date were discovered within weeks to months of vaccination. And here are some examples. We learned early on that the oral polio vaccine caused paralytic polio. We also learned that a higher number than expected of individuals that received the 1976 swine flu vaccine developed Guillain-Barré, which is a nerve disorder. Also, a rotavirus vaccine called RotaShield in 1999 led to bowel obstruction. 2009 H1N1 European vaccine with an increased risk of narcolepsy. All of these appeared within weeks to months and were caught by vaccine safety surveillance systems in place. This is one of the most highly scrutinized series of vaccines in the history of vaccines. Next slide, please. And one of the ways we are looking for side effects and monitoring is through vSafe. vSafe is an online tool that you can access and sign up for, and you will receive messages and daily check-ins initially, and then weekly check-ins asking you how you are feeling, what your side effects are, if you have had any problems with the vaccine. And this is a great way to get data on recently vaccinated individuals. There is also the VAERS Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which has been around for a long time, typically filled out by a provider, but can also be filled out by an individual. But vaccine safety monitoring is very important. Next slide, please. And I'd like everybody to just take a moment to read this slide because it has a very profound message. 1 year after the first US trials for a COVID vaccine began, 1 in 4, now more than that, Americans have received at least 1 dose of a COVID vaccine. There were 3.4 million vaccine doses given to Americans on Friday. That means about 90 million Americans have been vaccinated with at least 1 vaccine. 50 million have been fully vaccinated, and 535 million doses have been given in 141 countries worldwide. This is a vaccine that was tested for safety and effectiveness as well as any other vaccine. This is a vaccine that's not caused any reported death or permanent disability to those who've received it. This is a vaccine that prevents death and severe disease in pretty much anyone who gets it, and a vaccine that prevents the majority of mild or moderate illness. This is a scientific feat that is truly amazing. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Alicia. So in summary, we should be asking ourselves, why should we get the vaccine for COVID-19? Because even though you are healthy, you can still get very ill from COVID-19. Because we all have a role to play in making our society safer and contributing to herd immunity or community immunity. When you get this vaccine, you not only protect yourself, but you protect your coworkers, your friends, your grandparents, etc., your lovers. Because, as Alicia mentioned, the data show that this vaccine gives us more consistent and more durable immunity than natural disease does. And because, as Alicia said, we want to take these masks off and get back to normalcy. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and that is the end. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that information. It's incredible to learn about the history in the last year of developing the vaccine and just how robust that infrastructure has been to make sure that it's a safe vaccine. So we'll get now into some of the questions that we were sent by our community. And if anybody in the audience has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll see if we can get to them. Otherwise, as Marty said, we'll get back to you after tonight. So for the two presenters, Dr. Pouget and Nurse Maltzman, yesterday I spent a day without Boulder County at a vaccination clinic. One second.
Un segundo.
So we are waiting for the interpretation to come back on.
I think we should be good to go.
Okay, perfect. So as I was saying, yesterday I was at a vaccination clinic without Boulder County, and I noticed a lot of, and our partners as well, El Centro, Amistad, and different partners were there as well. When people were walking in to get the vaccine, I saw people praying, people who were Catholic like doing this, like people, I think the general population is concerned about the vaccine. And this specific town hall is for the LGBTQ community, which in many ways is maybe more concerned because of our history with healthcare. And so this is a question for anybody on the panel, but specifically to to Dr. Pouget and Nurse Maltzman. So how do we, what are the work that what work are you seeing within your field to better the trust between your field and the LGBTQ community, and how does that relate to your work with COVID?
Alicia, do you want to take that first, or would you like
Sure. So I think that that it really comes down to trust. And for example, my patients are actively asking me a lot of questions, and I'm trying to answer them the best way I can with science. And my patients trust me, and so I think that people have to find somebody who they trust to give them information and to take that evidence and opinion from someone they know and trust.
I could not agree more. And what the first thing I have learned is to listen and to meet people where they're at, because I get that, this is a new virus, this is a new vaccine, and there's a lot of mis and disinformation out there. And it's very hard for people to be able to sort through all of that and navigate that. And so as Alicia said, trust is key. And so, it's important to just have an honest and frank conversation with what we know, what we don't know, and what we're learning, and to be there for the patient, and to, again, most importantly, listen.
I'd like to add to that. So on a systems level, I think we need more Whitman-Walker clinics. And the Whitman-Walker clinic was an oasis during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I was a medical student on the East Coast, and I witnessed physicians refusing to treat people diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, and they did it without punishment. But the Whitman-Walker Clinic was the one clinic that provided culturally responsive care to all diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. And I think the secret to the Whitman-Walker Clinic is that it was co-designed by members, people who identified as LGBTQ+, and providers, and it received funds from the District of Columbia. So I'd like to see this model replicated.
Christina, do you have any comments to add?
Well, I just wanted to comment on the things that I'm seeing and the reasons people are not getting vaccinated in my office are fears of complications of the vaccine. So things such as hormones, how will they interact with my hormones? So I want to point out that millions of people for a variety of reasons are on hormones, whether it's estradiol or testosterone, and there have been no trends. They're monitoring everybody that is open to doing that and be safe afterwards. And there have been no trends that hormones are increased risk of side effects. There's also been last year, there was earlier people were worried about infertility and that there was some cross-reactivity that would increase the inability to get pregnant or maintain pregnancy. And those have since also not been demonstrated. So I want to make sure people are aware that fertility should not be delayed if that is something someone would like. But the most exciting information this week, that March 22nd, they just came out with a small study out of Boston that talked about pregnant people and lactating people that has increased robust immunity after the COVID vaccine. And they measured breast milk and placental, the blood in the placenta, and they found increased antibodies, which implies, which also it does need to be further studied, but implies protection to the newborn. So that was super fascinating. I know Pfizer has a study they started in February looking at this. So these are exciting things that are showing that the vaccine is safe for people on hormones, wanting to be or are pregnant. And most importantly, remember that people that are LGBTQ can be at increased risk of COVID infection complications. And this is diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and pregnancy. Those are, if you have those things, you're at increased risk of complications with disease. So being vaccinated has a less risk, virtually only temporary side effect of your illness, but at least get vaccinated.
Thank you, Christina. Your audio was a little difficult to understand. So if you don't mind, I'll ask Dr. Pouget to maybe help us summarize some of the points. The first point was around hormones and the safety of that. So Christina, I heard you say that research shows that people who are on hormones, regardless of the reason, are definitely encouraged to get the vaccine. And so
It's safe.
Yes, and I will summarize it succinctly as she did, but the bottom line is that it's extremely safe and effective and no interference at all. And again, there's insofar as pregnancy, we always advocate that people get vaccinated and receive all of their vaccinations prior to pregnancy. But so far, the data that we have with pregnant women having received these vaccines for COVID-19, that it looks very safe. And what Christina also mentioned is that there was a small study showing that women who had been vaccinated are passing antibody through their breast milk, and they found that in the cord blood and in the breast milk. And so, that may provide some theoretical benefit to the newborn, which is really marvelous in itself. So that's about it.
yeah, and then she also made a second point about infertility and that there was no. Yeah.
Right, okay. So that was I'm not even going to get into the weeds with this, but there was a former Pfizer scientist, a British guy, who basically said that caused a lot of ruckus, that there's a protein, this spike protein cross-reacts or interferes with a placental protein, can lead to infertility. But, again, placenta is already there when you're pregnant is one issue. So that's bogus. And two, there have been no reports of, patients losing their pregnancies or anything like that, preterm birth, who have received these vaccines. So the bottom line is that this has been debunked. And I tell my patients, again, I just counsel them that, these are effective and appear safe. I should also mention that patients who are still enrolled in these clinical trials will be followed for the next 2 years. They have committed to that. And again, this is one of the most highly scrutinized vaccines in the history of vaccines, as Alicia said. So all of these data will continue to be made available to the public. But what we have so far really looks good. And these vaccines are saving lives as we speak.
Thank you so much. Frank, I thought that the presentation did a really great job of covering the community of people who live with HIV. Although I wanted to make sure if you have any other question or you want to get deeper into that, to give you some space for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I feel like connecting, and I think this is with populations that experience some senses of marginalization or maybe multiple health issues, is connecting them to a medical provider where they feel comfortable, where they can open up to that provider, building the trust that Heather and Alicia talked about. I think that culturally responsive space in someone's language, if needed, is so important. And I think that's what we've seen with people accessing our services. They just need time to ask their questions, to process it with their peers, with their family, their partners, and then talk with their doctor. And I think when all those things come full circle, then we see a lot of buy-in and people getting really excited for the vaccine and so grateful when they can have access and start to feel that protection.
That's great. I want to go to I know we're running on time, so there's a couple questions in the chat, but I'll look at one that feels that I heard a lot yesterday as well, which is, when will we have more information on the next step and whether a booster or annual vaccination like the flu will be required?
I'm happy to answer that. The short answer is we don't know right now, but from all the experts that I've heard, some people think that we may need a booster in the fall. That includes these variants of concern. So the B1351, which is considered the South African variant, et cetera. So we may need a booster, but the CDC will give guidance on that shortly. But right now we don't know. But again, the thinking is that yes, this will ultimately likely be like a flu shot every year that will encompass likely several different variants, hopefully within one vaccine. The other thing we don't know, J&J is also testing a two vaccine strategy. Right now it's a one shot, one and done, but they're also looking at the effects of a 2-dose series. So all of these things are forthcoming, but again, I think it's going to be like an annual flu shot.
Thank you. And then the last question before we go is on, sorry, I just had it brought up. So outside of J&J, the two other available vaccines are 2 doses. And we've heard a lot. I think that maybe what people hear the most is that the second dose is like the scariest. That's where you're going to get where you might get the most severe symptoms. And you mentioned it in your presentation, but could you just again re-highlight the importance of getting that second dose if you do get the first dose and some of the science around it?
Yes. So I apologize. I forgot to kind of mention that the side effects, if you're going to get them, are more likely with the second shot, but you still can get them with the first shot. But yes, more likely with the second shot, because the first shot kind of provides what's called a prime. So it just shows your body, what it's going to have to do. And then the second shot is like, whoa, kicks it into high gear. And so you can definitely get these side effects. And again, they include local side effects, which are pain and swelling and redness at the injection site. And then you can feel crummy for a day or two. And I'm not going to lie about that. And I always give my patients the straight up. You may feel, like your body's aching, or you may have a little bit of a fever and a headache and just feel lousy. And you can take some Tylenol or Motrin if you get that. But again, that's just your immune system responding to the fact that you got a vaccine. That's it. These are expected. It's not an adverse effect. It's not an allergy or something like that. It's just your immune system doing its job. Now, that said, if you don't get these side effects, don't freak out that the vaccine isn't working because, people in the clinical trials, this was effective across all age groups and not everybody got these. So that's a point that needs to be understood as well.
Yeah, thank you. Alicia or Sarah, anybody else before we close? Any other comments?
There was just one other question I saw in the chat that I think is interesting, is that if you don't have side effects, is your immune system still working in the absence of side effects? Are you still getting the antibodies?
Right. So sorry if I didn't explain this well. And the answer to that is absolutely. So in the clinical trials, right, not everybody had those side effects. And so, but when they looked at the data, they saw efficacy across, all age groups, all, ethnic groups, and et cetera. So whether or not you had the side effects. So the answer is, it works. It's effective. So don't have a cow if you don't get those side effects. And lastly, I would just like to say something that I forgot to include in my presentation, which is the way I explained the mRNA vaccines to patients is that, and I heard Tom Frieden say this, who was a previous a CDC director, is that it's like you're sending your immune system an email with instructions with basically a picture of what this virus looks like, instructions on how to kill it, and then your body deletes that email. It's gone. So that's a good way if you want to explain this to patients, to kind of put it in those terms, because that really, I heard that, I'm like, oh, that's perfect. But these vaccines, and I will be quiet, are highly safe and effective, and I will talk ad nauseum about them because, again, there's just a marvel of science, a marvel of science.
Yeah, no, and there's just so much information that there is to be shared. And for the audience, if they observe any issues when they get their vaccine, a lot of people will be getting their vaccine from not their primary healthcare provider. So how can they maybe report any issues on respect or just any issues with a different doctor? And lastly, talk about maybe some of the ways that people who are administering the vaccine are getting trained or educated about the LGBTQ community who might not necessarily be their traditional clients.
Well, the first part about reporting side effects, that was that one slide in the presentation that talked about two different ways to do that. The first is you should be given information on the VSafe reporting tool when you get your vaccine, but this is an online tool to report any side effects. Was that your question?
It's more about if a doctor doesn't maybe respect, or an administrator doesn't respect like the pronouns that somebody has on their name tag, like what can be done around that sort of
oh, I see. So
yeah.
I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Well, I can talk about some of that. What we are doing at Boulder County Public Health, we are partnering with Out Boulder, and we're co-designing vaccine equity clinics that are culturally responsive. And we are learning from each clinic. And Marty probably has something to say about that. So I will turn the floor to you.
It's a great partnership, Sheila. Yeah, it was, hi, I'm Marty. This was just so wonderful. And thank you, doctors, for sharing this important information. I learned so much, and I know my texts are blowing up from people saying, wow, more people need to see this. So Charlie, thanks for remembering to record it. I had a panic attack at one point, it wasn't recorded. And it is. We found, so the survey opened some doors for us at Out Boulder County because we weren't seeing, we're not seeing in a lot of data the CDC collects or CDPHE, and I know Boulder Community Health through the new system they have with Epic are beginning to collect some real information on sexual orientation and true gender identities. And as we got our numbers and there was nothing to compare them to, and we weren't seeing, and Dr. Boucher, thank you for your honesty, and the numbers were too small in the clinical trials. We know what we know, and these vaccines have been out long enough that we know we're in good shape with them. But the fact that we weren't included or thoughtfully included in the first part is the new soapbox I stand on. In that, Boulder County Public Health listened to that. And we know that we're working towards herd immunity. And so we're developing a campaign on our own at Out Boulder County and with our important partners, including El Centro Amistad, Jorge, who is fantastic, my new best friend. I just love working with him. And we're putting a system together like the census almost, the hard to reach people for a variety of reasons. Now we're dealing with healthcare. People, our community, if you look at the social determinants of health, we're less likely to have a doctor. We're less likely to have any money, go down the list. So when it comes to, oh, there's a new vaccine, there's not a trusted person to talk to. right? I don't have that relationship. Because they don't know where, now they know where to find you, Dr. Paget, so your list has just got longer of patients, but that's the reality, right? And so public health is like, how can we work together? We have the science, we have the vaccines, you have the relationships. And so we've done 2 clinics, one a week ago, this past Saturday, where we vaccinated 200. The clinic went so well, we vaccinated 250 yesterday. Sheila, you weren't there for good reason, but the doctors at the end of the day said we could have gotten 300 through. It was a well-oiled machine. So it was very exciting to get done. And we're encouraging everyone and anyone listening to this, we encourage you to get the vaccine. And when you do, you're going to get this cool sticker that says vaccinated with pride. So make sure you get that. Even if you're not vaccinated at one of our clinics and you find one of these great vaccines somewhere else, let us know and we'll mail you one. We want you to let others know that you've been vaccinated. We want word out that this is safe. It's effective. We have lost over 500,000 people to this. This is not a time for us to say, oh, others are getting vaccinated. It'll be okay if I don't. Not true. So we want you to get vaccinated. Charlie's going to drop in the chat. We have a sign up list on our website. And Charlie, if I think is going to drop in the chat, but if you go to outboulder.org at the very top of the screen, you can get on our wait list. And so we don't have a clinic scheduled, but there's a good chance that we're going to have specific slots at Boulder County Fairgrounds where there'll be cultural brokers like me and Jose and others there to greet you, to make sure you're not misgendered, to make sure that there's somebody there who speaks Spanish to get you from start to finish. So this is just the beginning of vaccinations. I know there's a lot of people vaccinated. I learned that tonight, but there's so many more to go. So we want you to be vaccinated. If this has been recorded, it's going to live on a couple of different websites, so you can share it with friends who are unable to join us tonight. This is important. You may not want to go back to normal. I know I don't, but I want to go back to something new that doesn't just mean that I'm sitting in the house. So we can all do that together. We can start facing the isolation that we're all experiencing, some more than others, but we have to get vaccinated. If you have problems with transportation, we'll get you there. We'll address any issue you might have in being able to get to the vaccine. Please reach out, outboulder.org, or to any of our community partners, and we'll make sure you get vaccinated. Thank you all. Sheila?
I just have one other comment. Our goal at Boulder County Public Health is to make sure that vaccine uptake mirrors the diversity of Boulder County, including the Hispanic Latinx community, people identifying as LGBTQ+, people who might be unhoused, people without documentation, people living in mountain communities, other communities of color, people on the ability spectrum. So please reach out to us about getting vaccinated.
Thank you all. Doctors, thanks for working on a Sunday night. I know your rounds are that's all I learned that on TV, their rounds start in the morning early. And so I want to thank you all, and to Frank, Dr. Davis, Jose, Charlie, Vivi, thanks for being here tonight.
You know, I really liked what you said about not wanting to go back to normal, because normal is what got us in this mess in the first place. And so we're going to go to a new place now. I love that.
Yep. Thank you all. Together we're going to get through this. Thank you very much. Have a great night, everyone. Be safe.